Hello to everyone. Welcome to our Week 3 class online via screencast video. I hope that you're listening to this in a comfortable space and enjoying the extra time saved by not having to travel to South Point tonight. During this screencast, I will discuss 3 topics. First, I will talk about using your course rationale assignment to help you refine your intended learning outcomes, or as I like to call them, behavioral objectives. Next, we will discuss what sequencing is and the role that it plays in developing an effective curriculum. Finally, I will go over your assignments and reminders for our Week 4 class. So let's get started with refining our behavioral objectives. Now that you've composed your learning rationale, it's time to revisit your behavioral objectives. At this point, you may have gone ahead and turned your ideas list from our Getting Oriented assignment into behavioral objectives using the Bloom's or depth of knowledge charts provided for you during our Week 2 class. Or you may simply have the behavioral objectives that we composed in class together. Either way, you can begin the process of refining your objectives. Read each objective, or compose each objective statement, keeping your course rationale in mind. Ask yourself, are there objectives in my proposed unit or professional development that don't align with my assumptions about the problem I plan to address, the type of student I'm teaching, the needs of society my subject is seeking to fulfill, and my overall educational goal in teaching this content? If you have an objective that doesn't align with your course rationale, then discard it. Conversely, if there's an essential objective missing that has now come to light by composing your course rationale, that was not part of your initial ideas list, take a few moments to add that objective. If you need help with composing behavioral objectives at this point, refer to the PowerPoint and other resources provided in our Week 2 Blackboard folder. When you are finished, your end product should be a complete list of behavioral objectives for your unit or professional development that reflect your course rationale, beliefs, and assumptions. Now it's time to arrange your intended learning outcomes or behavioral objectives in a manner that maximizes learner understanding, or what I call devising a learning framework. Your learning framework relies on your sequencing. Sequencing is the efficient ordering of content in such a way as to help the learner achieve the objectives. Sequencing is an important step in the curriculum design process because humans don't learn new information in isolation. Those of us who have had a chance to study learning theory in previous teacher education programs know that humans learn by connecting new information and understandings to what they already have learned. Thus, creating a sequence for learning is key to your students' understanding. Although there are several sequencing strategies, the most commonly used were proposed by educational theorists Posner and Strike in the 1970s. They identified 3 general categories for sequencing schemes. In the next few slides, we will look more closely at each of these, but here's a general introduction to the types of sequencing. Learning-related is sequencing the content based on learner characteristics. World-related, where sequencing is based on spatial, temporal, or physical relationships, and concept-related sequencing, which is based on the relationships between the concepts to be learned. Let's look first at learner-related sequencing. Learner-related sequencing takes into account the abilities, prior knowledge, and interests of the learner. You have several options found in the learner-related sequencing category. Identifiable prerequisite is when you teach a skill required to perform another skill first. For example, teaching addition of whole numbers before teaching addition of fractions. Next, you have familiarity, where the instructor would begin with the most familiar information and then progress to the most remote. Often at the elementary level, in social studies curriculum, it is devised in a way where students in kindergarten and first grade learn about their neighborhood, and then the next year their city, then state, then U.S. history, and finally world history. Another option is sequencing by difficulty. This is teaching the least difficult before the more difficult. In a foreign language classroom, most students learn to speak in the present tense first, and then learn how to speak in the past tense because it's more challenging. Next, there's interest sequencing. In this case, the teacher would begin with the topics or tasks that will create the most learner interest. For instance, a science teacher might show the students what happens when she puts soda water and baking soda together before she teaches about chemical reactions. And lastly, there is sequencing for development. This sequencing ensures that the learner has reached the appropriate developmental level before teaching a task or topic. This type of sequencing was taken into account if we think about the difference between the objectives of our middle school health class with the objectives of our high school health class. Our next sequencing category is world-related sequencing. World-related sequencing takes into account how we define and order the things around us. As you can see by the subcategories presented on this slide, these tend to be concrete. Spatial sequencing would cover objectives in a logical order, left to right, top to bottom, north to south. A biology teacher might describe a plant, starting with the flower and moving towards the roots in sequence. Next, there's temporal sequencing, which looks at objectives in a historical or chronological manner. What happens first, second, third, or by length of time, like fastest to slowest. An example here could be a government teacher who is discussing how a bill becomes a law. And finally, our last option in the world-related sequencing category is physical sequencing. Essentially using physical attributes like roundness, hardness, large to small, color, or smoothness to sequence your objectives. I remember my biology teacher or geology teacher ordered his objectives using physical sequencing by presenting the various rocks from softest to hardest. The last of the three categories presented by Posner and Strike is concept-related sequencing. Concept-related sequencing takes into account the relationship of things, theories, perceptions, or attitudes. Starting first with class relations. In class relations sequencing, you teach characteristics of a class before teaching members of the class. For example, an English teacher might teach about the literary genre of transcendentalism before having her students read the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry David Thoreau. Propositional relation sequencing does the opposite, where an instructor would provide examples first, then the proposition or class. This might be used in a science class where a teacher shows her students an image of a butterfly, scorpion, crab, and centipede, and then teaches her class about the characteristics of arthropods. Next, there's sophistication sequencing. In this case, the teacher would order their objectives to begin with those that are concrete or simple, and then proceed to abstract or complex concepts. This is similar to difficulty sequencing, but designed more for abstract concepts or theories. For instance, a law professor might discuss punishments for social deviance before asking her students to grapple with the concept of justice. Lastly, there is sequencing using the logical prerequisite. Logical prerequisite prescribes that concepts necessary to understand another concept be taught first. In chemistry, an instructor would need to teach the concept of chemical reaction before introducing the concept of an enzyme that speeds up a chemical reaction. Now that we have reviewed the various types of sequencing methods, let's look at how one might employ them in sequencing a series of behavioral objectives. Here's a list of 6 objectives for a class on home fire safety. Select the correct fire extinguisher. Describe the types of fire classes. Describe how a fire gets started. Demonstrate how to extinguish a fire using a fire extinguisher. Differentiate the types of fire extinguishers, and describe the emergency procedures. If I left these objectives in this order, my students would most likely find themselves confused and lacking in their understanding of critical information. For instance, it would be hard for students to select the correct type of fire extinguisher, Objective 1, before learning about the different types of fire extinguishers, Objective 5. Having said that, it's important to emphasize that although there are some ineffective sequences, there is not simply one effective sequence. Your choice of sequence will depend on what you prioritize as an instructor. Let's take a look at a few examples. In this sequence, I employ logical sequencing, starting first with information about fires, then fire extinguishers, and finally emergency fire procedures for extinguishing a fire. I also consider familiarity in the sense that I think students will be more familiar with fires than fire extinguishers or emergency procedures, so I discuss fires first. Additionally, I use identifiable prerequisite sequencing in my choice to teach about the types of fire extinguishers before asking students to select the correct fire extinguisher for a given fire. In this next sequence, I want to prioritize student interest and grab their attention, so you can see that I choose to begin with demonstrating how to use a fire extinguisher and giving the students a hands-on activity to get them excited about what they're going to learn. Then I follow up with the different types of fires because most people would find that more engaging than the procedural information which would come later. So as you can see by looking at these two different examples, there are numerous effective ways of using sequencing in curriculum design. One can see the benefits of sequencing in the fact that it provides a structure for the designer and the learner, reduces learner anxiety, creates learner expectations, and helps produce positive outcomes. Now it's time for you to try sequencing with your behavioral objectives list. This is what I would like you to do for your learning framework assignment, which can be found in our Week 3 folder on Blackboard. After reviewing this PowerPoint again, if necessary, consider and select the sequencing methods that are best for your objectives. Type a 5-day sequencing plan that must include all of your intended learning outcomes or behavioral objectives. For a sample, consult our Week 3 folder on Blackboard. Below your 5-day sequencing plan, type a paragraph that identifies your selected sequencing methods and provide your reasoning for your choice. Then print out 2 copies of your learning framework and bring it to our Week 4 class meeting. For those of you who would like to reference information in our text for guidance, you can consult the information that I provide for you from our text in our Week 3 folder on